His liver's failing again, a young resident muttered, his voice tight as he studied the monitor. We're losing him, doctor. The statement fell like a stone into the hushed luxury of the suite, the private floor of St. Augustine Medical Center was no ordinary ward. It was the kind of place where wealth tried to buy not only privacy, but miracles. Wood-paneled walls disguised ventilators, ambient lights softened the reality of intensive care, and the suite carried the faint scent of cologne layered over antiseptic. It resembled a five-star hotel, but tonight its illusion was breaking. Leonard Carrington, a billionaire many considered untouchable, was shrinking before their eyes. The once commanding figure of a man who had built an empire in technology now looked skeletal against the hospital's white linen. His broad shoulders had collapsed inward, his skin had taken on a faint yellow hue, and his once thick hair clung to his scalp in uneven patches. He lay silent, machines filling the space where his voice once carried weight. Around him stood the best medicine could offer. 20 specialists had been flown in from across the country, each wearing their expertise like armor. Neurologists, cardiologists, hepatologists, men and women who had written textbooks and whose names were known in their fields. They spoke in clipped phrases, each report contradicting the last. No single diagnosis explained the full collapse of Carrington's body. His liver numbers were abysmal, his kidneys faltering, his nervous system fraying. Every path of logic led nowhere, and yet someone else was watching with different eyes. Clarissa Miles pushed her cleaning cart quietly into the suite, rubber wheels squeaking on polished marble. At 39, she had learned the art of being invisible. Her uniform, a pale green tunic with her name embroidered at the chest, was a disguise that rendered her unseen. She knew how to move through rooms without interrupting, how to catch fragments of conversations without appearing to listen. In this wing, she was background noise, but she listened. She always listened. Clarissa had not begun her life intending to clean hospital floors. 15 years earlier, she had been a scholarship student at Mid-Atlantic University, a rising star in chemistry, particularly toxicology. Professors praised her mind, telling her she had a rare ability to connect patterns and see what others overlooked. But tragedy had struck without mercy. Her parents' accident left her responsible for 3 younger siblings. The scholarship was abandoned, dreams of research dissolved under the weight of necessity. She traded textbooks for night shifts, lab coats for uniforms, yet the hunger for knowledge had never left. In breakrooms and libraries, she devoured scientific journals, kept up with toxicology case studies, and followed lectures online. She lived in a world that dismissed her as a cleaner, but her mind never stopped categorizing, analyzing, connecting. Now, as she moved methodically through Carrington's suite, dusting countertops and wiping chrome, her eyes swept over details that others ignored. Leonard's nails caught her attention first, yellowed in a way that wasn't consistent with jaundice alone. Then his gums tinged faintly blue, a discoloration easy to miss under the glare of hospital lighting. Her gaze shifted to the uneven hair loss, not random but patterned, as if mapped by something working beneath the surface. The air itself seemed wrong. Beyond disinfectant and expensive cologne, there was a faint metallic tang. Clarissa's pulse quickened. She had read about this before, years ago in toxicology notes she still kept in a box at home. The combination of hair loss, neurological decline, digestive failure, and discoloration, it was too distinct to be coincidence. She froze by the nightstand. The symptoms aligned perfectly with thallium poisoning. Her rag trembled in her hand. Dr. Whittaker's voice carried across the room, calm and authoritative. Silver-haired and perpetually immaculate, he was the kind of physician whose presence silenced debate. "Gentlemen, we've exhausted conventional pathways," he said, gesturing to Carrington's chart. "We are facing an unknown autoimmune cascade or something environmental. We must widen our scope." Clarissa stood only 10 feet away, polishing the surface of the mahogany counter. His words might as well have been addressed to the wall. He glanced in her direction once, but his eyes slid past her, landing on the nurses and residents instead. "Please make sure the cleaning is finished quickly," he added, not to her but to the room in general. We have urgent matters to discuss. Clarissa nodded reflexively, even though he hadn't truly spoken to her. She was used to it, the dismissal, the invisibility. To them she was a uniform, not a mind, but her thoughts raced, faster than her pulse. If she was right, Leonard Carrington wasn't dying of an unknown illness. He was being poisoned, slowly and deliberately. Her attention returned to the bathroom counter, where she aligned bottles out of habit. Grooming products sat in neat formation: cologne, razor, imported soap. And there, more prominent than before, a jar of sleek black hand cream with gold lettering. She had cleaned this room yesterday. That jar had not been there. The lid was faintly smudged, as if recently handled. Clarissa recalled seeing Malcolm Price, Carrington's longtime rival turned sudden confidant, entering the hospital earlier. The magazines had chronicled their feud for years, two titans of tech circling the same empire. Now Price appeared with regular gifts, gestures of support. Clarissa's gaze hardened. The jar's presence was too deliberate, its placement too insistent. And if the cream was laced with thallium, its daily application would explain everything. Absorbed through the skin, invisible to routine tests, relentless in its slow destruction, she gripped her rag tighter. The pieces fit. She knew what was happening, but who would listen to her? Monitors began to shriek. Nurses rushed forward. A resident shouted that Carrington's neurological responses were dropping further. The room erupted in urgent movement, 20 doctors converging to debate the next intervention. Clarissa stepped back into the shadow of the wall, her cleaning cart shielding her. She wanted to scream the word thallium, but her throat tightened. The memory of being dismissed, ridiculed, ignored pressed against her chest. If she was wrong, she'd lose her job, her only income, the stability her children depended on. But if she was right and stayed silent, Leonard Carrington would die. She whispered to herself, words barely audible beneath the alarms and the rush of feet. They don't see me, but I see everything. The monitors quieted as the doctors stabilized him temporarily. Their murmured debates filled the room once more, layered with theories that spiraled into abstraction. But Clarissa's certainty had already crystallized, as sharp and undeniable as laboratory glass. The truth was in front of her. It had been all along, and while the most expensive minds in America stumbled in the dark, the woman pushing a mop had already found the light. "Excuse me, miss, mind the monitors." A nurse's polite but clipped reminder barely brushed Clarissa's ears as she adjusted her cleaning cart against the wall. She nodded silently, blending back into the wallpaper as the medical team carried on. To them, she was scenery, the one who polished the floor, refilled paper towels, and vanished without sound. But Clarissa's invisibility was a gift. Unseen, she observed. Overlooked, she noticed. Every night, while the great minds circled their patient with theories and prescriptions, she pieced together her own mosaic of truth. Clarissa's life had become one long study in efficiency. 39 years old, mother of two, she worked nights to keep her children clothed and fed. Her uniform was always neat, her movements deliberate, her schedule exact. She didn't waste time because time never wasted itself on her. Each hour of her shift was an exchange, labor for survival. But in the quiet hours between, her mind wandered back to what she once was. She remembered sitting in lecture halls at Mid-Atlantic University, a scholarship student with professors who used words like brilliant and exceptional. Clarissa had been drawn to toxicology because it felt like detective work with molecules. Learning how the smallest particles left the loudest evidence, she thrived in those classrooms. She saw patterns quickly, often faster than her peers. She lived for the puzzle. Then came the accident. Her parents' deaths left her as guardian to 3 younger siblings. Tuition lapsed. The scholarship disappeared. She dropped out, promising she'd return one day. That day never came. Instead, she took jobs, first waitressing, then cleaning, anything that paid reliably. She raised her siblings like children of her own. By the time they were grown, it was too late to return. Life had shifted and she had her own children to care for, but Clarissa never stopped studying. At lunch breaks, she read borrowed textbooks. At night after shifts, she streamed lectures on her aging laptop. Her colleagues gossiped or scrolled social media. Clarissa underlined articles about obscure toxins, exposure pathways, and medical case studies. She didn't need credentials to keep learning. Knowledge was hers to keep, whether anyone recognized it or not. Now, here in Leonard Carrington's suite, all of that hidden knowledge flared awake. Clarissa moved efficiently, wiping down the bathroom's marble countertop. Her eyes slid, almost involuntarily, to the cluster of personal products: imported soap, a gold-handled razor, cologne worth more than her monthly rent, and that jar of black and gold hand cream, sleek and expensive, positioned just so. She had noticed its arrival the day before. Now, it had shifted slightly closer to the bed, as though deliberately placed for Carrington's convenience. Clarissa's memory worked like a camera. She knew the exact spot it had occupied yesterday because she had aligned it herself while cleaning. Someone else had moved it. She thought of Malcolm Price, the billionaire's rival turned caretaker. The magazines described their rivalry like war, once bitter enemies, now seen in public together, as if time had healed wounds. But Clarissa didn't believe in coincidences, not when patterns screamed louder than appearances. Every time the jar appeared, Carrington's condition worsened. It was subtle, the kind of correlation overlooked in the chaos of medicine, but Clarissa saw it clearly. She thought of her toxicology notes. Thallium, colorless, odorless, absorbed through skin, a poison so clean it masqueraded as illness, confusing even seasoned physicians. Delivered slowly, it killed in whispers, not shouts. Still, Clarissa's certainty meant nothing in this place. She had tested those boundaries before. The week before, she had quietly mentioned an unusual pattern of symptoms to a nurse she trusted. The woman smiled kindly, thanked her for caring, and then reminded her that medical matters are for medical staff. The sting had stayed with her. Knowledge meant little when it came from the wrong uniform. Now she didn't dare speak, yet her mind kept working, connecting dots, drawing invisible lines no one else seemed to notice. Doctor. Whitaker swept past her, deep in conversation with two specialists. His voice, calm and polished, filled the room without effort. We'll rerun the panels. If nothing emerges, we broaden to autoimmune hypotheses. Organ failure without cause suggests a systemic trigger. The doctors scribbled notes, nodding obediently. They saw only the data on their charts, never the discoloration at the patient's gums or the faint metallic tang in the air. Clarissa saw it all, but her vision meant nothing here. Whitaker brushed close enough to bump her shoulder lightly, not even glancing at her. To him, she was a piece of furniture, something to navigate around. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. That was the difference. They didn't notice her, but she noticed them, and because of that, she could see what they couldn't. Her invisibility extended beyond the hospital. Outside, Clarissa's life was built around being overlooked. She rented a modest two-bedroom apartment where her children, Marcus and Tasha, learned to fend for themselves when her shifts ran long. Neighbors waved politely but didn't know her well. She was never the mother at PTA meetings or school plays. Her job kept her away. Instead, she slipped through life quietly, unnoticed. But here, invisibility gave her power. She could stand in Leonard Carrington's room while 20 specialists argued, absorbing everything, filing away details, building her hypothesis piece by piece. They would never suspect her of watching. Clarissa's eyes drifted to Carrington himself. He stirred faintly in his sleep, machines humming beside him. A man who had built empires was now reduced to fragile breaths. His skin glistened faintly under the lamplight. His fingernails, the color of tarnished brass, confirmed her suspicion again. Her heart pounded, but her face stayed neutral as she moved a cloth across the counter. At one point, a young resident muttered to another, "I've never seen a progression like this. It's like multiple conditions at once." The other replied, "Reynolds says autoimmune cascade, but the labs don't match." Clarissa kept her head down, polishing a surface that was already spotless, but their words echoed in her mind. They didn't realize they were describing poisoning, not disease. The symptoms weren't random. They were orchestrated. As the doctors left for a consultation, Clarissa stood alone in the room. She looked at the billionaire on the bed, then at the jar of cream. She whispered to herself, "You're dying and they don't even see it, but I do." For a fleeting second, she saw her reflection in the dark window. The uniform made her look ordinary, forgettable, but behind her eyes burned the same mind that once impressed professors, the same mind that now recognized thallium poisoning as clearly as a written equation. She was invisible to them. But invisibility, she realized, gave her an advantage. She saw everything they missed, and though she hadn't yet decided how, she knew this. She couldn't stay silent much longer. The suite door whispered open on oiled hinges, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. Malcolm Price had arrived. Clarissa noticed him before anyone announced his name. His presence carried weight, a man who had lived too long in boardrooms and headlines not to command attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, with tailored precision in every seam of his suit, Malcolm looked more like a statesman than a rival. Yet Clarissa had read enough business magazines in waiting rooms to know his history. Once Leonard Carrington's fiercest competitor, now his self-proclaimed friend. The story had been told and retold. Two titans of tech, bitter rivals for decades, reconciled in the twilight of their careers. But Clarissa didn't believe in fairy tales. Malcolm carried a single item in his manicured hand, a sleek black jar with gold lettering. Even from her vantage point near the window, Clarissa recognized it, the hand cream. "I brought this for Leonard," he said smoothly, setting it on the nightstand with deliberate care. His voice was low, assured, the tone of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed. "It's the only brand he trusts. Imported from Switzerland, made with botanicals. Comfort is everything at a time like this." Dr. Whittaker nodded absently, already shifting the conversation back to lab reports. To the physicians, the jar was a triviality, a luxury item for a wealthy patient, nothing more. But Clarissa's eyes tracked every movement. Malcolm's hand lingered a second too long on the jar, as if to ensure its placement would not be overlooked. The cream was positioned prominently, angled toward Carrington's bed so it would be noticed and used. She had seen enough patterns in chemistry to know deliberate placement when she spotted it. Clarissa bent to wipe the edge of the polished side table, but her gaze never left the jar. Her mind returned to her studies, the late nights hunched over toxicology case reports. Thallium poisoning was infamous for being difficult to detect, a perfect poisoner's tool, odorless, colorless, slow, devastating. When absorbed through the skin, it worked silently, creating a cascade of symptoms that mimicked other illnesses. Hair loss, peripheral neuropathy, abdominal pain, progressive organ failure. Carrington had them all, and now, with Malcolm Price standing at his bedside, Clarissa felt her certainty solidify into something unshakable. The billionaire stirred faintly, his hand twitching against the sheets. Malcolm leaned down, speaking softly into his ear, though Clarissa couldn't hear the words. He unscrewed the lid of the jar and dipped his fingers in, applying a sheen of cream across Carrington's hand. It looked tender, almost intimate, an old friend easing another's suffering. But Clarissa's stomach tightened. She could almost see the invisible particles sinking into Carrington's pores, slipping past skin to wreak havoc on his blood and organs. She gripped her cleaning rag until her knuckles whitened. Malcolm stayed only 15 minutes, but every second felt calculated. He asked Dr. Whittaker questions about progress, nodded gravely at updates, offered sympathetic murmurs. When he left, he gave Carrington's hand a final pat, then glanced once around the room, his eyes sweeping over doctors, nurses, passing directly through Clarissa as though she were air. She exhaled slowly once the door closed behind him. Her gaze returned to the jar. It sat gleaming in the lamplight, innocent to all but her. She thought of her chemistry professors describing how thallium compounds dissolved seamlessly into creams and lotions, creating perfect delivery systems. A few applications each day, and the accumulation would begin. Carrington's decline hadn't been sudden. It was gradual, systematic, perfectly aligned with the timeline of Malcolm's visits, and the hand cream was the common denominator. Later that night, Clarissa overheard two residents as she mopped the hallway just outside the suite. "His decline is like nothing I've ever studied," one whispered. "Multiple conditions overlapping, nothing conclusive," replied the other. Reynolds insists autoimmune, but the numbers don't fit. Clarissa kept her head down, pushing the mop in slow arcs across the gleaming tile. But inside, her pulse quickened. They didn't realize they were confirming her suspicion. To them, the overlap was a riddle without answer. To her, it was the unmistakable fingerprint of poison. She adjusted her routine to linger in Carrington's room longer than necessary, careful not to draw attention. Each evening, she checked the jar. Its level dropped steadily, evidence of use. Sometimes she caught faint traces of metallic sheen in the cream, so subtle that only someone looking for it would notice. The doctors dismissed environmental causes quickly, preferring more prestigious theories. Viruses, autoimmune cascades, genetic anomalies, but Clarissa knew better. The answer wasn't in exotic research, it was in plain sight, sitting on the nightstand. On her break, Clarissa sat in the staff cafeteria with her notebook open, pages filled with cramped handwriting. She mapped symptoms against dates, aligning them with the days she had seen Malcolm visit. The correlation was precise. Every appearance of the jar marked another downturn in Carrington's health. She drew arrows, circled dates, wrote thallium, in bold letters. Her heart pounded as she stared at the page. The truth was so obvious, and yet she was the only one who could see it. Her reflection in the cafeteria window stared back at her, tired eyes, uniform creased from long hours, hair tied back carelessly. To the hospital, she was a cleaner. But she knew she was more. Returning to the suite, Clarissa found Carrington weaker than before. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale against the white sheets. Nurses adjusted his IV, doctors murmured in corners, but no one noticed the jar. No one questioned why a dying man's rival was bringing him imported cream so faithfully. She did, and the question burned in her mind. Was she willing to risk her job, maybe her entire livelihood, to make someone listen? Her children's faces flashed before her. Marcus, 12, who dreamed of becoming an engineer. Tasha, 14, already studying biology with a fire in her eyes. They depended on her. The paycheck from this job paid their rent, bought their food, kept their world stable. If she spoke and was dismissed, or worse, fired, what then? But Leonard Carrington didn't have time for her hesitation. Each day, the poison tightened its grip. Clarissa lingered a moment longer than usual, staring at the jar, at Carrington's trembling hand, at the monitors charting his slow decline. She whispered under her breath, words meant only for herself. They don't see it, but I do. And if I don't act, he will die. The decision pressed on her like weight. For years she had survived by staying invisible, but invisibility had become unbearable now that she carried the truth. Somehow she had to break through the barrier of her uniform. Somehow she had to be heard. "Excuse me, Dr. Whitaker." The words barely left Clarissa's lips before they caught in her throat. She had rehearsed them quietly all morning, whispering into her cleaning rag, convincing herself that she could find a way to be heard. But now, standing in the physician's conference room as they reviewed Carrington's deteriorating vitals, her courage shrank against the polished walls. Still, she managed to place the folded note on the clipboard. 4 words, written in her cramped but steady hand: check for thallium poisoning. She slipped out silently before anyone could question her. The next morning, Clarissa lingered near the doorway of the conference room, her cart positioned just beyond sightlines. The doctors had gathered early, their suits crisp, their voices calm despite the urgency of their patient's decline. She heard the rustle of paper, then Whitaker's voice, sharp with derision. "And apparently," he said, tone dripping with sarcasm, "our cleaning staff has developed medical theories now." A ripple of laughter followed. Chairs creaked as heads turned toward each other, not toward her. Someone left an anonymous note suggesting thallium poisoning. He continued, "Gentlemen, we already tested for heavy metals. This is precisely why medical decisions should be left to professionals." More laughter, a low murmur of agreement. Then, without pause, the conversation pivoted back to autoimmune hypotheses and experimental drug regimens. Clarissa gripped the handle of her cart until her knuckles whitened. The note felt like ashes in her pocket. They hadn't just dismissed the idea, they'd mocked it, mocked her. Later that afternoon, she intercepted Dr. Patel in the hallway. He was younger, less rigid than Whitaker, someone she had seen hesitate when others scoffed. She timed her approach carefully, her heart hammering in her chest. "Dr. Patel," she said softly, lowering her voice, "I think Mr. Carrington is showing classic signs of thallium poisoning. The hair loss, the gum discoloration, the neuropathy." He stiffened immediately. His eyes darted to the nurses nearby, then back to her. "That's an interesting theory," he said quickly, voice tight. "But we already ran panels. Heavy metals were negative." "Not if it's gradual exposure," she pressed. "Standard tests could miss." He cut her off, checking his watch. "I appreciate your concern, but I have to be somewhere." Then he was gone, coat tails brushing past her like a door slamming shut. Clarissa stood rooted to the spot, her face hot with humiliation. Her words, precise and careful, had dissolved before they reached him. That evening, as she wheeled her cart down the dim corridor, a security officer approached. His tone was professional, but the warning was unmistakable. "Miss Miles," he said, folding his hands behind his back, "we've had reports that you're interfering with medical matters. This is your final reminder. Stay within your duties. If this continues, we'll have to escalate." Her throat tightened. She nodded, murmuring an apology she didn't mean. As the officer left, the sting of tears pressed at her eyes, not because of fear, though losing her job terrified her, but because of the injustice. She had the answer. She could see it clearly. And yet she was trapped in a uniform that made her voice weightless. Back in the suite, Leonard Carrington was slipping further. His skin looked waxen under the ambient lights, his breath shallow, his nails more yellowed than before. The monitors told a story of decline, steady and merciless. Nurses bustled, adjusting lines, checking vitals, unaware that their efforts were only delaying the inevitable. The jar of hand cream still sat on the nightstand, its glossy surface reflecting the lamplight. Clarissa wiped the table beside it, her rag passing dangerously close. She felt the urge to seize it, to carry it down to the lab and demand testing. But she knew the risk. If she was caught tampering, she would be dismissed instantly. Her eyes flicked to the door where security had stood hours earlier. The warning echoed in her mind, "Know your boundaries." But boundaries, she thought bitterly, were killing him. That night, she sat in the empty staff break room, her dinner untouched beside her. She pulled an old notebook from her bag, the same one she had used years ago as a student. Pages were filled with formulas, reaction diagrams, toxicology notes she had copied from borrowed textbooks. Her fingers traced over the section on heavy metals. Thallium mimics potassium in the body, colorless, tasteless, odorless. Progressive symptoms: hair loss, peripheral neuropathy, organ failure. The words stared back at her, undeniable. She whispered to herself, "It's all here, every symptom, every sign. How can they not see it?" But she knew the answer. They didn't see it because they weren't looking, and they weren't looking because they didn't believe poison could be at play, because no one expected a billionaire to be slowly murdered under the noses of 20 experts. And certainly no one expected the cleaning staff to recognize what they missed. At home later, Clarissa tucked Marcus and Tasha into bed. Marcus asked why she seemed distracted. Tasha, more perceptive, simply studied her mother's face and didn't press. When the apartment fell quiet, Clarissa sat at the kitchen table with her old toxicology textbook. She opened to the chapter on thallium and reread it for the 100th time. The words felt like prophecy now. She scribbled symptoms in the margins, aligning them with dates she remembered from Carrington's chart updates. The pattern was undeniable. Her hand trembled as she wrote, "If I don't act, he will die." The next evening at work, Clarissa noticed Malcolm Price again in the lobby, another jar in his hand. He smiled easily at staff, exuding the air of a man above suspicion. Clarissa's stomach turned. Each visit meant another dose, another step closer to the edge, and yet the doctors remained blind. Clarissa felt herself at a precipice. To remain silent meant watching Carrington die, knowing she could have stopped it. To speak meant risking her job, her stability, her children's future. But some choices, she realized, weren't choices at all. Standing in the empty corridor outside Carrington's room, Clarissa whispered to herself, steadying her resolve. If I must risk everything to make them see, then I will. The decision crystallized in her mind like a chemical reaction, reaching its inevitable conclusion. For years, invisibility had been her shield. Now it would become her weapon. The jar gleamed like a trap under the lamplight, innocent to everyone but her. Clarissa stood by the nightstand, rag in hand, watching Leonard Carrington's shallow breaths. Each inhale sounded weaker, each exhale more labored. The monitors charted a steady descent, and still the doctors spoke of autoimmune cascades and rare genetic conditions. Clarissa no longer doubted. The poison was right there, within arm's reach. The question was no longer if, but how to prove it. Her opportunity came during shift change. For a brief moment, the room stood empty, nurses off exchanging notes, doctors away consulting charts. The billionaire lay unconscious, machines humming, the world unaware. Clarissa's pulse thundered in her ears. She glanced at the door, then back at the jar. One movement and her future could shatter. One movement and she could save a life. Her hand trembled, but she moved anyway. With practiced stealth, she unscrewed the lid and dipped a sterile specimen container, borrowed discreetly from the supply room, into the cream. A small amount, no more than a teaspoon, disappeared into the container. She sealed it tight, slipped it into the deep pocket of her uniform, and replaced the lid. The jar sat exactly as before, untouched, unremarkable. But Clarissa knew better. In the quiet of a maintenance closet, she assembled her tools. Not laboratory equipment, not the sophisticated instruments she once dreamed of commanding, but the makeshift arsenal of a cleaner with a scientist's memory. A roll of aluminum foil from the kitchen, baking soda stolen from the cafeteria pantry, white vinegar, disposable gloves, plastic cups meant for staff water breaks. To anyone else, these were scraps. To Clarissa, they were a chemistry kit. She moved carefully, methodically, her motions muscle memory from years long past. She remembered her toxicology professor's voice describing the telltale signs, the reactions that separated thallium from other metals. The sodium rhodizonate test, the subtle color change, the distinctive precipitate. It could be replicated crudely, even with limited means, if the mind behind it understood the principles. Clarissa did. The reaction unfolded slowly, a dance of patience and precision. She worked by memory, combining solutions, watching the mixture shift. The metallic sheen in the cream began to react, blooming into evidence, at first faint, then undeniable. Her breath caught as the solution darkened in exactly the way she remembered from her studies. Thallium. Her suspicion wasn't a guess anymore. It was proof. She snapped photographs on her phone, hands steady now. Image after image captured the crude but clear result. Her evidence would not be perfect. It would not hold against the scrutiny of a formal lab, but it was enough to demand attention, enough to force them to see her. She sank onto the stool in the closet, staring at the photos, her heart pounding. For the first time, she allowed herself to whisper it aloud. I was right. The next step was riskier. Proof of poison meant nothing without a pattern, a suspect, a motive. She needed more than chemistry, she needed context. Clarissa had already been quietly collecting fragments. She remembered every time Malcolm Price entered the suite. Every shift when the jar appeared, freshly opened, freshly placed. Every downturn in Carrington's health that followed. She began compiling it all into her notebook during breaks. Dates, times, symptoms, visitor logs. Arrows and circles traced a story that no one else had written yet. February 12, Malcolm visit. New jar arrives. Hair loss worsens. February 15, jar half used. Gum discoloration noted. February 19, Malcolm visit. Second jar appears. Neuropathy symptoms escalate. February 23, sudden liver failure. Cream used twice daily. The pattern was perfect, too perfect to ignore. Her resolve hardened, but fear shadowed every step. Security had already warned her once. Doctors had laughed at her note. If she stepped forward now, with crude test results and obsessive notes, would they dismiss her again? Would she be fired on the spot? She thought of Marcus and Tasha waiting at home, the rent due at the end of the month, the groceries she stretched into meals, the fragile stability she balanced on a paycheck that could disappear with one wrong word. Yet she thought, too, of Leonard Carrington, his frail body failing under fluorescent light, a man with all the money in the world, surrounded by 20 brilliant doctors and still slipping toward death. And she thought of Malcolm Price, his hand lingering just a second too long on the jar, his eyes sweeping over her like she didn't exist. Clarissa's jaw tightened. If invisibility was her curse, then invisibility was also her weapon. She could move unseen, she could gather more, she could build a case no one could laugh away. Her moment of reckoning came 2 nights later. Another alarm, another code blue, doctors rushing, nurses scrambling. Carrington barely clung to life. Clarissa stood just outside the door, rag in hand, her eyes fixed on the black jar gleaming at the bedside. She whispered into the chaos, not for them but for herself. "If they won't see it, I'll make them." When her shift ended, Clarissa didn't go straight home. Instead, she sat in the staff cafeteria under the dim glow of vending machines, spreading her notebook across the table. She arranged her crude photos beside it, aligning evidence with dates, symptoms with visitors. The story sharpened into something undeniable. She had the poison, she had the delivery method, she had the timeline. Now all she needed was the courage to put it in their hands. At dawn, she slipped the container of cream back into her bag, along with her notes and photos. Her children would wake soon, expecting their mother home, breakfast on the table. But Clarissa knew sleep would not come for her, not until she broke through the wall of silence that surrounded her. Her hands trembled as she whispered one final truth into the empty cafeteria. "Tomorrow I stop being invisible. Mr. Carrington is crashing again." The alarm pierced the suite at 2:14 a.m., and the carefully constructed calm of St. Augustine Medical Center shattered. Nurses surged to the bedside, machines screamed, and 20 of the nation's best physicians clustered in a storm of white coats and urgent whispers. Clarissa Miles stood against the wall with her cleaning cart, watching. To them she was a shadow, a background detail blurred into the furniture, but inside her chest her heart was a drumbeat of certainty. She had already tested the cream. She had the photographs, the notes, the timeline. She knew the truth. And now, if she didn't speak, Leonard Carrington would die. Dr. Whitaker barked orders in his usual calm, commanding tone. "Neurological responses are collapsing. Increase oxygen. Run another tox panel." Clarissa's fingers clenched around the rag in her hand. Another tox panel, another delay. The results would return inconclusive, just like before. They were asking the wrong question. She looked at Carrington. His skin glistened with sweat, his fingernails yellowed further, his gums faintly blue. Each detail screamed what her professors had once drilled into her mind: thallium. For days she had stayed silent, invisible, the good employee who knew her place. But silence now meant complicity. Clarissa inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the moment press on her ribs. Then she stepped forward. "He's being poisoned." The words cracked through the room like glass shattering. Every head turned. For the first time in her life at this hospital, 20 pairs of eyes landed squarely on her. Whitaker blinked, his face hardening. "Excuse me." Clarissa swallowed, but her voice steadied. "It's thallium poisoning. His symptoms, hair loss, neuropathy, gum discoloration, match exactly. And I tested the hand cream. It's contaminated." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then laughter, quick and dismissive, rippled from the back of the room. Whitaker's expression soured. "This is a closed medical conference. Please leave at once. Security will escort." But Clarissa didn't move. She reached into her bag and pulled out her notebook, her phone, the specimen container. She placed them on the table between the physicians with steady hands. "The evidence is here. Photographs of the reaction test, dates of Malcolm Price's visits, every time he brought a new jar." Each visit matched a downturn in Carrington's condition. The delivery method is simple, absorbed through the skin. Slow, cumulative. That's why your panels missed it. The room's energy shifted. Laughter faltered. "Doctor." Patel leaned forward, scanning her notes, his brow furrowed. "Hair loss, gum lines, neuropathy, it does line up." Another specialist, Dr. Winters, lifted the specimen container with gloved hands, studying the metallic sheen. You said you tested this. With what method? Clarissa met his gaze. Sodium rhodizonate reaction, modified for field conditions. The color change was unmistakable. A murmur ran through the room. Winters's eyes flickered with reluctant respect. That's not common knowledge outside advanced toxicology. Whitaker's jaw tightened. This is absurd. You're a cleaner, not a physician. You are not qualified to. I was a chemistry scholar before life intervened. Clarissa cut in, her voice rising for the first time. I left school to raise my siblings after our parents died, but knowledge doesn't vanish because you change uniforms. I see patterns you've overlooked, and I know I'm right. Her words hung heavy, sharper than any monitor alarm. Doctor. Patel turned to Whitaker. Sir, it's plausible. Standard panels may miss thallium if exposure is low but continuous. Another doctor nodded slowly. The timeline does fit. And the patient's presentation, textbook, if you think to look for it. Whitaker's face hardened, but doubt flickered across his eyes. Authority had shielded him for decades, but now authority was cracking. Clarissa pressed on, her voice calmer now, clinical. Check his hair. 3 months of exposure will show in growth patterns. Test the cream properly. You'll find elevated thallium levels in both. The silence that followed was not dismissal this time, but consideration. Minutes later, a nurse rushed in with preliminary results from an emergency panel requested on Clarissa's insistence. The words cut through the room like thunder. Confirmed. Significant thallium levels present. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Orders flew, treatments shifted. Whitaker's commanding tone returned, but it sounded brittle now. Administer Prussian blue. Prepare chelation therapy. Clarissa stepped back, heart hammering. She had forced them to see. She had dragged the truth into the light. Carrington's monitors began to stabilize, numbers climbing slowly, tenuously. A flicker of life returning where death had loomed. Dr. Whitaker approached her, his tall frame no longer so imposing. His voice was strained, reluctant. Your intervention was correct. He struggled with the words. Completely correct. Clarissa nodded once, professional composure masking the surge of vindication flooding her chest. How did you see what 20 specialists missed? He asked, genuine confusion shading his tone. She looked him directly in the eye. Because I was invisible. I observe without being observed. I see patterns without preconceptions. And I never forgot my training, even when the world forgot me. Whitaker didn't reply. He simply nodded, the weight of humility pressing on his shoulders. Across the room, Leonard Carrington stirred faintly, eyelids fluttering. The room hushed as his lips moved. What happened? Doctor. Whitaker straightened, hesitation flickering across his face. This was his chance to claim credit, to preserve his reputation. Instead, he gestured toward Clarissa. You were poisoned, Mr. Carrington. We missed it, all of us. She didn't. Every eye turned toward Clarissa. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. She was undeniable. Carrington's gaze, weak but clear, found her. Thank you for seeing what they missed. The words struck deeper than any applause could. Recognition not from doctors, but from the man whose life she had saved. Then, unexpectedly, the sound of clapping. Dr. Patel first, then Dr. Winters, then the rest. A ripple of reluctant but genuine applause filled the room. Clarissa stood taller, her composure unshaken, her eyes steady. She had forced them to see her, not the uniform, not the cleaner, but the mind. And though the battle wasn't over, though Malcolm Price remained free, though proof of intent still had to be gathered, Clarissa knew the tide had turned. The invisible wall that separated her from recognition had cracked, perhaps irreparably. Hours later, FBI agents arrived, briefed by hospital security. Questions swirled, evidence was collected, and Malcolm Price's name appeared on everyone's lips. But through it all, Clarissa moved with quiet efficiency, answering when asked, presenting her notes, her photographs, her crude but accurate test. For years she had been unseen. Now she was indispensable. And as dawn broke over the hospital, painting the sky in pale light, Clarissa allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Leonard Carrington would live. The truth had been spoken, and invisibility had finally become her strength. The hospital buzzed with whispers. Word spread faster than the alarms that had shaken the executive wing hours earlier. Doctors who once looked through Clarissa now nodded when she passed. Nurses who had dismissed her quiet observations smiled with tentative respect. Even security officers who had warned her to know her boundaries now treated her with deference. Clarissa Miles had been invisible her whole life. But overnight, invisibility had turned into legend. Leonard Carrington's vitals improved steadily after the antidote. The billionaire who had been circling death now slept more peacefully, color returning faintly to his cheeks. His survival was no miracle of medicine. It was the result of a housekeeper who refused to remain unseen. Dr. Patel sought her out in the corridor later that morning, his face weary but softened by admiration. "You saved him," he said simply, offering her a seat in the break room, something he had never thought to do before. Clarissa accepted, lowering herself carefully. Her hands trembled only slightly as she wrapped them around the paper cup of coffee he placed before her. For the first time in years, someone at the hospital treated her not as background, but as a colleague. "How did you know?" Patel asked, voice low, awed. Clarissa looked down at the steam rising from her cup. "Because no one looks at me. And because I never stopped learning, even when I had to leave school. They all saw a cleaner, but I saw the patterns." Patel nodded, unable to argue. He understood what Whitaker, with all his pride, had struggled to admit. Brilliance was not the property of a uniform. By the next day, the news had broken. A leak from hospital staff, amplified by Sarah Chen, a travel blogger who had streamed the confrontation in real time, lit up social media. Housekeeper solves medical mystery. 20 doctors failed, she found the poison. The invisible genius who saved a billionaire. Journalists swarmed outside the hospital, their cameras flashing, their microphones ready. Hospital security tried to keep them at bay, but the story had already escaped containment. Clarissa's name was trending across platforms she had never used. Meanwhile, the FBI acted swiftly. Surveillance footage revealed Malcolm Price's routine, arriving with a jar of cream, insisting staff apply it, lingering with calculated care. Chemical analysis confirmed Clarissa's findings, thallium laced in luxury packaging, dosed slowly over weeks. The motive was corporate and cold. Price had sought to push Carrington out before a pivotal merger, weakening him until the empire he built could be overtaken. Price was arrested without ceremony, his tailored suit doing little to disguise the arrogance slipping from his face. "You can't prove intent," he sneered as agents cuffed him. But the jars, the timeline, and Clarissa's meticulous notes proved plenty. When Leonard Carrington finally woke fully, his first request stunned the doctors. "Bring me the woman who saved my life." Clarissa entered the suite quietly, her uniform still the same, her steps careful. She expected gratitude, perhaps a polite thank you. But Carrington, his voice still weak, reached out a trembling hand. "I owe you more than my life," he whispered. "I owe you my faith. You saw what 20 experts could not. Tell me, how do I repay that?" Clarissa shook her head. "You don't. You just live." But Carrington's eyes, sharper now, studied her. He saw beyond the uniform, past the exhaustion in her face. He saw the mind. "Then let me give you back what life took from you," he said. 2 weeks later, Clarissa found herself sitting not in a hospital supply closet, but in the glass tower of Carrington Innovations. The office looked down on the city like a throne room of steel and light. Across the mahogany desk, Leonard Carrington handed her a folder embossed with gold lettering. Inside, a full scholarship to finish her chemistry degree, living stipend included. Guaranteed placement in a toxicology lab upon graduation, and an additional fund set aside for her children's education. "This isn't charity," Carrington said, his voice firmer now. "It's investment. Brilliance shouldn't be wasted because life was unfair." Clarissa's hands shook as she held the papers. For years she had carried her knowledge quietly, privately, like a flame cupped against the wind. Now someone with power had seen it and chosen to shield it. Back at home, her children's reactions brought tears she hadn't shed at the hospital. Marcus's eyes widened. "So you're going back to school, Mom?" "For real." Tasha, older and more perceptive, smiled through her tears. "You didn't just save him, Mom. You saved us." Clarissa hugged them both, feeling the weight of every sacrifice, every night shift, every humiliation finally transform into something worth carrying. Months passed. Clarissa split her time between classes at the university and her position in the toxicology department. Professors who once praised her brilliance welcomed her back with awe, surprised by the path that had led her here. Colleagues respected her not just for her sharp mind, but for the story whispered in hallways. "She's the one who saved Carrington." At the hospital, her role shifted too. She was no longer seen pushing a cart down the corridor, but walking with charts in hand, consulted by the very doctors who once ignored her. The hierarchy had bent, if not broken, around the force of her truth. A year later, Carrington hosted a private ceremony in the hospital auditorium. The Beaumont Scholarship for Scientific Resilience was announced, a permanent fund for students forced to leave their studies due to hardship. The first recipient stood nervously at the podium, thanking Clarissa by name for inspiring them. As applause filled the room, Clarissa sat in the front row, her children on either side, tears shining in their eyes. She thought of the years she had been invisible, her brilliance hidden behind rubber gloves and mops. Those years had not been wasted. They had trained her to see what others missed, to notice details ignored, to persist when dismissed. Her invisibility had been her strength. Later, as she prepared for her first official case in the toxicology lab, Clarissa paused to look at the white coat draped over her chair. She thought of her old uniform, folded neatly in a drawer at home. She hadn't thrown it away. She never would. It was a reminder of the path she had walked, of the invisibility that had shaped her into the woman who saved a billionaire and changed her own life forever. Her phone buzzed with a new request, another hospital facing a mysterious case, asking for her consultation. Clarissa picked up, her voice steady, her title earned. "This is Clarissa Miles," she said. "How can I help?" For the first time, the world listened.